So today we'll be talking about Beowulf lines 1 through 836, which you actually read for Monday, but we're going to compress the ending of Beowulf into one kind of lecture video because I think there's more to do to introduce the text here. So today we'll be talking briefly about how we have the text, which is from a manuscript. We'll be talking about Old English poetics. It's the language that Beowulf's written in, as you've probably noticed from your copy of the text. So we're going to be talking about features of Old English and how those play out in the literature. And then we'll talk at the end about the prologue and kind of the intro to Beowulf as a text itself. The story of Beowulf takes place around the 500s AD. We think it was composed in the 700s, but our manuscript that we get the story from is dated to about 1000 AD. And so this manuscript, it's a part of the Cotton Library at the British Library in London. It formerly belonged to Sir Richard Cotton, who is an antiquarian. And this is the only extant copy of Beowulf. It doesn't have a title, it doesn't tell us who the poet is, which is why we just call it Beowulf after the main character, and we refer to the writer as just the Beowulf poet. It's important to note that this codex was damaged in a fire in 1731, and that, among other things, is one reason we have a hard time reading it in places, which is why you have such a kind of new, heavily edited text. And you might also be wondering what a codex is. Well, a codex is simply just a bound book that's illuminated. And by illuminated, I mean it has lots of fancy pictures in it. So how do we get from this image that you see here at the first page of Beowulf to the actual story? Well, it involves something called paleography, which is literally the study of old handwriting. So this involves deciphering, reading, and dating historical manuscripts. It gives us the details like all the dating that we just talked about with Beowulf, and it allows us to understand the cultural context of the writing, including certain methods and oral traditions that might be lying behind it. It also includes scriptoria and the history of scriptoria. So that's all other things written in the book. And this could include illuminations, like we just talked about, which are the fancy pictures, as well as marginalia, which are little notes that people like to read in the margins of books. These can be notes about the text itself. They could be just simple marks indicating like a bookmark, basically. They can also be little kind of hand-drawn pictures as well. This might seem very straightforward until you get to certain problems with paleography. Among these is something called minims, which are short vertical strokes used in certain scripts or styles of writing. And this is the basic stroke used for I, im, in, and u, thus the word minim. It's kind of onomatopoetic. And so this becomes really problematic in Latin. So this is a sentence invented by a scribe, and it goes something like this. Mimi numinum nivium minimi munium nimium vini muniminum iminui vivi minimum volunt. So besides being a silly tongue twister like that, and you can see the translation there, this phrase, when written out, demonstrates exactly how hard it is to kind of see what words are actually present in the text based on the handwriting. And this becomes even more difficult when you get to Gothic black letter script, which you can see here, in which there are no connectives between these minims. And so I think the easiest word to see here is volunt, but all of the rest really just blends together. So you can take a stab at trying to read this, and hopefully this makes you appreciate how hard it is for paleographers to interpret texts and figure out what the text actually has to it. Other problems with paleography include erasures. So when a scribe messes up, or when a later reader doesn't like a certain word, they will go and scrape off the ink from the manuscript, and you get something like you see here at the top. Or we get things like covered readings, where part of the manuscript covers up another part, and it's hard to tell exactly what's there. This has become a lot easier now with the evolution of cameras and images, and we can use things like different types of daylight and even ultraviolet radiation to kind of scan the text and see what's actually going on there. And this also helps with a new problem about palimpsests. And so a palimpsest is when a manuscript is made up of pages from a formerly written manuscript. And so as you can see in the slide, you have erased writing or really faint writing underlying the really bold new writing of the actual book. And so palimpsests are really interesting because they're essentially recycled manuscripts. And it's really kind of a BOGO deal. You get 2 books for the price of 1. So that's about it for problems with paleography in the Beowulf manuscript, but just 2 last notes. Sadly, Beowulf does not have any illuminations. There are only illuminations for the other books in the Codex. And there are 2 scribes to Beowulf, so it wasn't finished entirely by one person. Scribe A wrote all the way up to line 1939, and then Scribe B takes it to the end. Just to give you a little taste of what Beowulf would have sounded like in Old English, I have the first several lines here from it, and here's some audio.
Hratway gardena in jardagum, Theud kuninga trimje prunon, Hutha edelinga sellen fremedon. Oft sjuld shaving sjaldena thratum, Monigum meitum meldo setla of ter, Ezo de erlas, Sittan arest where thou shalt funden. Ethes provre je bad, Weuks under wolknum, Werth myndum thar, Of that him ei quilch thara Sittendra over hron rare hyran sjode gomban judan that was good kuning.
So hopefully you were able to hear some things that sound a little bit familiar to English. My favorite part is the last bit where he just says, like, that was good kuning, which means that was a good king. So very similar there. But hopefully you heard some alliteration and you maybe saw some of the compounding of words. So just to remind ourselves, alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. So a good example of this is in the last line where he says gumbangudam. So the g there is a good example of alliteration. And so we see lots of compounding all over Old English, as we do in most modern Germanic languages. So for example, we have Gardena, that means the spear Danes. We have Yardagam, the your days or the days of yore, right? So we see lots of these single words that are actually compounds of 2 words. A little bit different than that, however, are things called kennings, which are specific to Old English poetry and something we haven't really seen before, though we do have them in English. So these are 2 words that come together to mean another word. They're not just random combinations, and they're usually poetic. So for instance, the Hronrade is the whale road, and that means the sea, or in other words, the road that whales travel on. Funnily enough, the human body has a kenning called Banhus, or the bone house. So that's fun. And to get even more poetic, the kenning for sun is Rodores Candel, or the sky's candle. And lastly, formulas should be pretty familiar since we talked about them in Homer as like formulaic endings to lines, so-and-so said, etc. Beowulf has these too. For instance, Gombanguldan, which we just talked about, means pay tribute. We also have epithets such as Ecphrael's son. So-and-so son appears very often. And you can see 2 other examples here on the slide. Last but not least, let's talk about the text itself. So here's a map of all the people mentioned in Beowulf, or related to the people mentioned in Beowulf. So you can see the Geats, the Swedes, the Danes, the Jutes, the Angles. That should all sound familiar. Beowulf is a Geat, and in the story he is going over to the Spear Danes. So he's going from the red area of the map to the purple area of the map. Even though the poem is written in Old English, these populations would not have spoken Old English, right? So they are located in Scandinavia, and they would have spoken these older Scandinavian languages like North Germanic, Old Norse, all these antecedents to Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and that sort of thing, which is obviously related to Old English, but more like cousins instead of brothers or sisters or something like that. And you can see these squarely on the right side of the map under the Germanic family tree branch of the Proto-Indo-European big tree that we talked about in the last video. But now that we're situated with respect to the characters and the peoples talked about in the text, let's start talking about the prologue, which is lines 1 through 11. And so in the past we've talked about the first word of the epic being very important, especially in Homer, right? So we had Manon, rage for Achilles, and Andra, in the Odyssey, which talked about the fact that Odysseus was a man, not a god, and so it was like very concerned with mortality and mortals. In Beowulf, the first word that we get is what, or what, and that doesn't tell us a whole lot. So we need to look to the rest of the lines in the prologue to figure out what's going to be happening in this epic. And we get two main things. One, a general respect for antiquity, right? So we get the Yar Dagum, or in the your days, so it's going to be talking about things that happened in the past. And then we get a focus on the mighty kings, or the Danish kings. And of these Danish kings, we start getting a kind of list of characters. So the first up is Shield Chieftain, who is good for mainly because of two things: deeds in war, and he got outlying clans to pay tribute to him. So he got people to pay him money and fancy items, right? And so in this way, he's very similar to Homer's doer of deeds and speaker of words, right? This definition of a hero that we get from the Iliad. We also learn that he gets a dope funeral at sea, so that's neat. Second, we get Beal and Halfdane, and we don't find out too much about these two yet. Before moving on to Hrothgar, and Hrothgar is important, A, because he built Heorot Hall to party in with Mead and his war winnings. And so in this hall, we get bards and alcohol serving as entertainment. This should be very familiar to us because of Odysseus' adventures in Phaeacia with the Phaeacians, where obviously we talked a lot about bards and Xenia and guest host relationships and the telling of stories and what part that had to play there. But obviously there is a great evil befalling Heorot and Hrothgar and the Spear Danes all together, and that is Grendel. So in a way, Grendel is a lot like the Grinch, staying up on his little like mountain den and just wreaking absolute havoc on these people. And this is how Beowulf comes to get involved in the story. Beowulf ultimately gets involved because of reasons for family debt. So Hrothgar before helped Beowulf's ancestor Ecgtheow. I know that's not how the name looks like it's pronounced, but I promise that is the way it's pronounced. Hrothgar helped Ecgtheow pay something called the Were-Gild, or the man price, and this helps to avert war. So instead of going to war with the neighboring people, you could just pay them a lot of money and make the problem go away. So you've already posted about your kind of first impressions of Beowulf and like how you think he compares to the heroes that we've seen in Homeric epics and in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But I would challenge you to think about how Beowulf appears in relation to these other figures and how the characterizations of Beowulf change as you keep reading. So keep all of this in mind as you continue on through the epic, and that's it for this video.